living room and around the world. And now, your feature presentation.
What if there was a way, without being an athlete, to feel what athletes feel? To play all the time, instead of working. Or else to enjoy work so much that it becomes essentially the same thing. It's 1962 in Portland, Oregon, and Phil Knight is at a crossroads in life. He's just graduated from college and now has an impossible choice to make. Does he follow the standard route expected of him, of getting a stable yet ultimately unfulfilling career? Or does he take the path less traveled, into the unknown, to pursue a crazy business idea that he just can't stop thinking about? Success has always been traditionally defined as having a good job, getting married, starting a family, and the house with the white picket fence. But deep down, Phil knows he wants something different, something purposeful and creative and important. He wants to leave his mark on the world, which brings him back to that crazy business idea he had in college. Maybe, just maybe, it could actually work. He begins running harder and faster, like he's chasing something, until he catches his second wind. In his final year at college, Phil took a course on entrepreneurship, and the assignment was to come up with a business plan and present it to the class. Phil quickly spots a potential opportunity. It's the 60s, and Japanese manufacturers were making inroads into the camera market, long dominated by German companies. Japan's focus on efficiency and lower labor costs helped them undercut the industry leader. And Phil began theorizing that the same could also be true for running shoes, another product dominated by German companies that Japan was also challenging. And it was a product that Phil, as an avid runner, already had an intimate knowledge of. His mock business would import low-cost running shoes from Japan and sell them for high profits in America. His presentation was met with mostly blank stares from his classmates. The teacher was impressed and gave him an A. But now that school's out, Phil is not at all looking forward to the prospect of working a boring job for the rest of his life. And the class assignment is still on his mind. He's young and figures he may never get the chance to have a wild adventure like this later in life. So he decides to just go for it and fly to Japan to find a manufacturer and try to make his pretend business into a reality. But to do that, first he'll need his father's permission to go traveling abroad instead of finding a job. And more importantly, he'll need his money for the plane ticket, which wouldn't be easy. His father was a stern patriarch, a lawyer turned newspaper publisher who prided himself on maintaining a sterling reputation among the high society circles of Portland. He would surely reject such an outlandish request. His dad revealed to him that he had regretted not seeing the world more when he was his son's age. The trip is on. Phil packs a suit and catches a flight to the land of the rising sun during a time when 90% of Americans had never even traveled more than 100 miles from their homes, and he was headed to a country that not too long ago was at war with America, all to pursue a crazy idea. The way Phil saw it, history is just one long processional of crazy ideas. Phil arrives in Kobe and secures a meeting with Onitsuka, maker of the popular Tiger running shoe brand. The company is Japan's premier athletic shoe manufacturer, boasting 500 shops across the island nation, with a growing reputation among international runners, while still relatively unknown in America. This is it. He gives himself a quick pep talk. You are capable. You are confident. You can do this. You can do this. He's brought into a stuffy boardroom occupied by a clan of stone-faced executives. He had rehearsed this meeting countless times in his head, but now face to face with these titans of industry, his mind draws a blank. All eyes are on him now. It's the moment of truth, his one and only shot at making a first impression. And he's stuck. Struggling to remember anything, he begins repeating the same presentation he made in his business class, word for word, emphasizing the very lucrative U.S. market for running shoes. An executive asks, "How big of a market is it?" But Phil didn't know. Horrified, he realized he hadn't done enough homework. On the spot, he comes up with the biggest number he can think of. It's $1 billion market. It was a total bluff, an utter shot in the dark. The executives begin excitedly chatting amongst themselves, and then one asks a follow-up question. "What is the name of your company?" But Phil hadn't thought about that either. His mind begins to race again. His eyes are on the executive, but he starts looking through him as memories of his childhood bedroom begin flooding to the surface. He now only sees the running trophies and blue ribbons on his wall and blurts out, "Blue Ribbon Sports of Portland, Oregon." They only have one more question for Phil. Would Blue Ribbon Sports be interested in representing Onitsuka in America? Why, yes. Yes, it would. He's made it all the way to Japan with nothing but a dream and has talked his way into a deal to sell tigers in America. He's presented the paperwork to formalize what he hopes to be the beginning of a beautiful friendship. Phil places a sample order with Onitsuka and works as an accountant while waiting a full year for the shipment to arrive. And when it finally does, he knows exactly who he wants to send a pair to first. His old college track coach, Bill Bowerman. He was a man of Oregon, whose reputation was world-renowned, having led athletes in the NCAA as well as the Olympics, and 16 of his runners would break the 4-minute mile. But Bowerman was much more than a coach. He was a mad scientist, constantly in his garage, modifying his runner shoes to improve their performance. Bowerman likes the Tigers so much, he wants to be Phil's business partner, offering money for inventory and suggesting Phil keep 51% equity to retain control. But even with Bowerman's chip-in, Phil still doesn't have enough to place an official order, once again forcing him to turn to the bank of Dad. But for him, the mood had already changed. He didn't put his son through college just for him to become a damn door-to-door shoe salesman. But overhearing them from the kitchen, Phil's mom takes cash out of her purse and says in a tone loud enough for her husband to hear, "I'd like to purchase 1 pair of limber-ups, please." It's 1964 and Blue Ribbon Sports is officially open for business. Phil loads his car with tigers and heads downtown to try and get them into local sporting goods stores. But all the shop owners tell him the same thing. Not interested. According to them, the world doesn't need another running shoe. Phil was facing resistance right out of the gate, but he didn't come this far to let rejection stop him now. He hits the road and starts selling tigers out of the trunk of his car. He would roll up to track meets all along the Pacific Northwest, showing off his merchandise and getting an enthusiastic response everywhere he went. The nifty new shoes from Japan were practically selling themselves. He also prints out flyers and posts them all over town with his number and address included. Soon, not only was the phone ringing off the hook, but twitchy runners began showing up at his father's doorstep like dope fiends looking to score. There in his living room, Phil's dad would watch his son conduct business in utter disbelief, while his mom was in the kitchen, either cooking or doing dishes, but always while wearing a pair of size 6 Tiger running shoes. Life couldn't be going any better. Phil was happier than he'd ever been, selling footwear to help his fellow runners. He was living the dream, making money doing what he loved. But then, the other shoe dropped. One day out of the blue, Phil gets a letter from a wrestling coach in New York who used to be a print model as the Marlboro Man. Phil opens the envelope and is met with a deadly surprise. The Marlboro Man claimed that he had just secured national distribution rights from Onitsuka and was now demanding that Phil cease and desist. His fairy tale world is shattered. This can't be happening. He'd only started his business 2 months ago and is already grappling with a menacing rival attempting to bully him into submission by threatening Blue Ribbon Sports with swift legal action. Phil fires off a frantic letter to Onitsuka seeking reassurance of his deal with them. And then he waits. And he waits. But he gets no response. This was a nightmare. His dream was being stripped away from him and he couldn't do anything about it. Over the entire summer, Phil moped around the house, utterly inconsolable over the sudden demise of his shoe company. It was all over before it had even started. By summer's end, with still no word back from Japan, Phil was beginning to accept the harsh reality that he would have to give up and get a real job. But on Labor Day, he changed his mind. He can't let it end like this, even if it means flying back to Japan to meet with Onitsuka. His dad still didn't like him selling shoes, but he also didn't like anybody messing with his son either. His parents both agree that he should go back and fight for his business. His mom offers to drive him to the airport. Phil is too tense to speak during the entire car ride. After arriving at the gate, his mom leaves him with the parting words, "Just be yourself." Phil's back in Japan, back at the Onitsuka office, and this time, he comes face to face with the owner and namesake of the company himself, Mr. Onitsuka. Phil had spent the entire flight preparing a professional presentation, but now, sitting across from him, he abandons his notes and instead launches into a heartfelt rant, highlighting Blue Ribbon's strong sales and how much they were growing, but how stressing it was to have the Marlboro Man crossing their turf. Mr. Onitsuka gets out of his chair, walks over to the window, and begins gazing into downtown Kobe. He finally breaks the silence by speaking about a marvelous vision he has of the future. Everyone in the world wear athletic shoes all the time. I know this day come. He then lowers his gaze onto Phil and in a soft voice tells him, "You remind me of myself when I am young." Mr. Onitsuka decides to allow Blue Ribbon to keep selling tigers in the western states, and they would restrict the Marlboro Man's sales to the east. Blue Ribbon would live on. Phil is overjoyed. Suddenly, all of the majestic beauty of his surroundings comes fully into focus, and instead of flying right back home, he decides to spend some time exploring more of Japan. With his guidebook in hand, he catches a train. Next stop, Mount Fuji. They met in the clouds, at a resting station on the side of the snow-capped mountain. She was also an American tourist in her early 20s and came from a wealthy family in Maryland. Her father owned a candy bar company. She noticed he wasn't sweaty like the other climbers, which he attributed to his conditioning as a half-mile runner. She ends up visiting him in Portland, against her father's wishes, and charms the whole family at dinner. Then the star-crossed lovers share a magical week together playing house. Afterwards, they maintained a long-distance relationship. But eventually, the frequency of their communications started decreasing, until one day, the honeymoon ends. Over the phone, she tells him that she wants to break up. Phil is devastated. He wrote to her, pleading that she reconsider. And she wrote him back. The answer was still no. In his first year in business, Phil sold 1,300 pairs of Tiger running shoes, generating $8,000 in sales. One day, at a random track meet, he runs into an old college teammate, Jeff Johnson. He's a married social worker now with a baby on the way, and to make extra money, he's selling shoes on the side. For Adidas. Phil can't believe it. He offers Johnson $1.75 for each pair of Tigers he could sell instead. At the time, running for exercise wasn't even considered a thing. Joggers were seen as wackos and were often mocked and even harassed when spotted in public. Johnson, the social worker, now found his true calling serving the persecuted runners of the world. He would file away his customer details on index cards to keep in close contact with all of them. And he'd regularly send out tips and tricks and birthday and Christmas cards, as well as letters congratulating them on winning their races. Johnson's tireless efforts led to sales more than doubling. By year 3, Blue Ribbon was doing well enough to open a physical store down in Santa Monica, California, making money hand over fist. company was growing year over year. But according to the bank, that was a problem. They told him, growth off of your balance sheet is dangerous. But Phil was confused. How could a company grow too fast? He argued, life is growth. Business is growth. You grow or you die. However, the bank manager was indifferent. But the bank was the least of Phil's problems. His contract with Onitsuka was expiring when Johnson discovered an ad inside of a track and field magazine by somebody claiming to be the national supplier of Tiger running shoes. And it wasn't a stranger. The Marlboro Man was back, and deadlier than ever. If the ad was true, then Blue Ribbon's days were numbered. But Phil is back in Japan now to renew his contract, and Mr. Onitsuka does have a fondness for him, so maybe he will side with Phil over the Marlboro Man once and for all. Unfortunately, this time, Phil has to settle for a meeting with another executive, named Kitami instead. Phil talks up Blue Ribbon's continuing growth and requests that Onitsuka give them exclusive national distribution rights. Kitami explains that Onitsuka wants someone bigger and more established to be its national distributor. Ideally, a company with offices on both coasts, not just the West. Without blinking, Phil responds, "But we do have an office on the East Coast." He was lying through his teeth, assuring Kitami that not only does Blue Ribbon have an office in the East, but will soon have one in the Midwest as well. They can handle national distribution, no problem. Phil is granted his request. He's now the official U.S. distributor of Tiger running shoes. Onitsuka will be sending the next shipment to Blue Ribbon's East Coast office, an office that doesn't even exist. Phil promises to wire them from the address later, once again narrowly escaping Japan with his company still intact. For now. Phil sends Johnson on a mission to find an office somewhere on the East Coast, and he settles in Boston. Back west, Phil makes a new hire, Bob Waddell, a standout runner on Coach Bowerman's track team whose career was tragically cut short in a freak accident. Phil was working full-time as an accountant while spending nights and weekends on the business. He had no social life, but was perfectly content, except for his day job. It was suffocating him. He needed a change. He quits and gets a gig teaching accounting at Portland State instead. There in his classroom, he's captivated by a beautiful student named Penelope Parks. She was so attractive that Phil was finding it hard not to stare at her. One day, she stayed after class and asked if he would consider being her mentor. Phil is taken aback, but keeps his cool long enough to say he'd be honored. He then impulsively asks if she'd like a job, bookkeeping for his shoe company. She's hired, and just a short year later, Miss Parks is promoted to the title of Mrs. Knight. Meanwhile, Coach Bowerman was busy writing a book about running for a nation of sedentary citizens. He was frustrated that the term athlete was regarded by the general public as a title only reserved for the pros. And he wanted to change that perception. When he wasn't at his desk typing, Coach was back at his workbench tinkering. One day, he thought about taking the midsole from one pair and fusing it with the outer sole of another, and sent the specs over to Onitsuka. The result was the perfect long-distance running shoe with a sleek, modern aesthetic. Paying homage to the '68 Summer Olympics that were held in Mexico City, Bowerman wanted to name the new shoe the Aztec. But he was too late, because Adidas had already released a shoe called the Azteca Gold and threatened to sue Blue Ribbon if they didn't change the name of their shoe. Bowerman asked Phil, "Who's that guy who kicked the shit out of the Aztecs?" And Phil replied, "Cortez." To which Bowerman then responded, "Okay. Let's call it the Cortez." Sales exploded, helping Blue Ribbon close the year stronger than ever with $84,000 in revenue. Shortly after the Cortez's release, Bowerman's book was finally published. Jogging would go on to sell 1 million copies and kickstart a movement across America, with Blue Ribbon Sports becoming the trusted source for running shoes. On campus, Phil meets art student Carolyn Davidson and hires her to design print ads. Up to that point, when it came to marketing, they'd just been winging it with crude drawings and made-up words like swoosh fiber. By the end of the 60s, through Blue Ribbon's efforts, 70% of U.S. runners now owned a pair of Tigers. After 5 long years of being in business, Phil is finally able to draw a salary and quit teaching to work on his business full-time. He survived rejection from local shops, clashes with the Marlboro Man, and even quarrels with the bank, all to keep his business afloat while laying the groundwork for Onitsuka to dominate the U.S. market. But rather than thank Phil for his service, Onitsuka decided instead to stab him in the back. It's 1970, and a major change is underway. In San Francisco, California, the age of tech is dawning, and with it, an innovative new approach to entrepreneurship is being conceived. Welcome to Silicon Valley. Private equity firms focused on hyper-growth are starting to form, and the concept of venture capital is taking shape. The emergence of these well-endowed, high-risk investors became a beacon of hope after Phil's fast and loose spending in the name of growth had finally caught up with him. The bank was now terminating their relationship. With nothing to lose, Phil's last hope is selling off 30% of the company in an initial public offering. And hoping to attract these new tech-focused VCs, he creates a holding company and names it Sport Tech, offering stock at $2 a share. He printed ads of the offering and was hoping for a $300,000 windfall, but would ultimately have to withdraw it after failing to sell even a single share. He thought to himself, maybe he was just a fool all along to dare chase a dream. But maybe not, because Phil would receive some much-needed help from the most unlikeliest of places. Bob Woodell's parents. They were hardly wealthy, but still withdrew their entire life savings, $8,000, and handed it over to Phil. And in the process, saved the company. Stunned by their unbelievable generosity, Phil asked, why were they doing this? And Mrs. Woodell held his hand and told him, because if you can't trust the company your son is working for, then who can you trust? But all of the money in the world can't buy loyalty. In business, the greatest asset isn't capital. It's leverage. And Phil was about to learn that lesson when Katami visits him and makes an indecent proposal. Onitsuka wants to own 51% of Blue Ribbon, giving them majority control. And Phil must comply or else, as Katami puts it. This can't be happening. A hostile takeover. Phil wants to punch Katami in the face, but holds back and tells him that he needs time to discuss it with his business partner, Coach Bowerman. But it was just a ploy, so Onitsuka would keep sending them shoes while Phil searched for a new supplier. He remembers a factory in Mexico that he heard about during the Olympics. It's an established facility that also makes shoes for Adidas. And all they need from Phil is a name and a logo. He pays Carolyn Davidson $35 to come up with a logo for a brand that doesn't even have a name yet, and he only gives her a vague idea to work with. But she rose to the occasion and handcrafted a masterpiece. She produced a striking design that was both contemporary yet also primal at the same time. Johnson and Waddell were impressed, but Phil wasn't sure. The logo was a far easier choice than picking a name would prove to be. After days of brainstorming, the frontrunners were Falcon, Bengal, Condor, and Phil's suggestion, Dimension 6. The only thing they agreed on was that they had a big problem. But then, one night, a name comes to Johnson in a dream. Nike, the Greek goddess of victory. Phil has reached the deadline for providing the factory with the name, and up to the last minute, he's still not sure what to go with. He's launching a new brand and going up against a friend-turned-foe in a winner-take-all market. Ultimately, Nike, being the goddess of victory, reminded him of Churchill's speech about nothing being more important than that.
You asked, what is our aim? I can answer in one word: victory. Victory at all costs. Victory in spite of all terror. Victory however long and hard the road may be. For without victory there is no survival. Let that be realized.
It's 1972 in Chicago at the National Sporting Goods Association show. It's the premier event attended by manufacturers, wholesalers, and retailers of sports equipment from across the country. And it's the site where Nike is officially introduced. It chose orange for the color of their shoeboxes to stand out amidst a sea of white and blue ones used by all of the other brands. And it was working. Curious convention goers flocked to their booth, intrigued by this strange new brand with the groovy logo. What the hell's a Nike? They'd ask. What the hell's a swoosh? Orders for Nike shoes came pouring in, smashing expectations. But it wasn't because of their clever marketing spiel. Vendors gave the new untested brand a chance based purely on the strength of Blue Ribbon's reputation. Phil also secured new funding by connecting with a Japanese trading company. They tried keeping Nike a secret from Onitsuka, but Kitami made another surprise visit to Blue Ribbon's store and found a mountain of orange shoeboxes. Upon discovering their covert operation, Onitsuka immediately terminates its contract with Blue Ribbon. They are now sworn enemies. At the 1972 Summer Olympics, Nike would come out of the gate strong, releasing their own version of the Cortez to rave reviews. But Onitsuka would sue Nike in court over the rights to the immensely popular shoe. The original Cortez was conceived by Coach Bowerman, but sold under Onitsuka's brand. In the end, the judge ruled in favor of Nike, forcing Onitsuka to change the name of their shoe to the Corsair, while still allowing both companies to sell their versions of the disputed shoe, making the Cortez the only shoe in history to be simultaneously sold by two different brands. It's official. The battle lines have been drawn. The humble startup from Portland is now competing with the Japanese juggernaut. Onitsuka had more money, more credibility, and a longer history of making shoes. But what they didn't have was pure American ingenuity. By the age of 19, he had made the cover of Sports Illustrated. And by 24, he was already dead. But in that short time, he still left an unforgettable impact on the sports world. He was Steve Prefontaine from Eugene, Oregon, a ferocious runner who trained under Coach Bowerman and captivated the nation while taking Nike along with him on the ride of a lifetime.
Measured in numbers, he was a success. 7 NCAA titles, every American record between 2 and 10,000 meters, undefeated on his home track over a mile. But more, Pre was a phenomenon. He stood for individualism, rebellion, and the pure joy of competition.
At 21 years old, Pre was headed to the '72 Olympics in Munich, Germany, as the youngest competitor on the track. And as an aggressive frontrunner, he was poised to bring home the gold. For Pre, racing was all about determining who had the most heart on the field, while his more experienced opponents relied on tactical strategies to ensure victory.
Well, I think everybody knew my plan. For me to win a race against competition of that nature, I have to go out hard and just about lead from the start, because the runners in that field are all runners that hang on and then outkick you at the last. So my tactics was just to go strong and run the first 3/4 of a mile hard and then just hang on the last quarter.
In the end, his intensity would be neutralized by the wily veterans.
This is the final lap. And the American attacks on the outside, but Gamudi responds. We're in there, and these three now, 7-8 meters clear of Ian Stewart, and these are the medal men. 200 meters left. The champion Gamudi leads. Viren moves up inside Prefontaine. The Finn and the American gathering for the final attack. And here comes Viren chasing his second gold medal. Viren goes for home. Gamudi is bankrupt. So too is Prefontaine. And the Finn goes in now for his second gold medal, and Stewart with a late run. The Finn wins. Gamudi second. Stewart gets the bronze. Prefontaine dies in the final stride.
Even though he suffered a heartbreaking loss, his gutsy performance on the world stage cemented his status as a living legend. Back home, Pre was also causing a ruckus by speaking out against the American Athletic Union. The AAU prohibited amateur athletes from making money through endorsements. In order to remain eligible for the Olympics, Pre was reduced to surviving on food stamps and began publicly criticizing the organization's treatment of amateur athletes, calling for its reform. And he'd soon find an ally. Phil Knight wanted to help and created a job at Nike just for him. Pre became their National Director of Public Affairs, an intentionally ambiguous title that enabled the company to keep him on the payroll. He already loved the product and unabashedly promoted the company everywhere he went. His belief in Nike ran so deep, he even allowed Coach Bowerman to use his foot as a cast for a new shoe. The University of Portland had recently updated its running facilities with the same polyurethane coating used on Olympic tracks. But Coach Bowerman's runners were having trouble on it. Their shoes weren't able to grip the surface very well. The coach was at a loss for a solution. Until one Sunday morning, while in his kitchen, watching his wife make breakfast, Coach has a crazy thought. He became transfixed by the waffle iron and decides to take it into the garage, where he then proceeds to pour shoe batter on it. The waffle trainer is born. Prior to its release, for over 50 years, the soles of running shoes had remained flat. The waffle trainer had protruding nubs on the bottom, creating extraordinary grip. It was a monumental achievement in footwear from a company that was just getting started. In May of 1975, Pre organized a tour of races that concluded in his hometown. He would win the 5,000 meter that day. Later that night, Pre would meet with friends to celebrate. He was taking running into the mainstream while training hard towards redeeming himself at the upcoming Olympics. But tonight was all about cutting loose and having fun. After the party, it was time to go home. Steve Prefontaine would tragically pass away in a car accident after driving under the influence. He was 24. His shocking death was not only a massive blow to the sports world, but it would be an even bigger loss to his friends and family. When Pre was 8 years old, his big sister came home and found him hitting his head against the wall and crying. He told her, "I'm stupid and I'm dumb and I'm never going to do anything right." She just held him and said, "Honey, someday you're going to find something you can do. And when you find it, that'll be your gift." Years later, she witnessed him running in front of large crowds with the people all stomping their feet and yelling, "Pre, Pre, Pre!" And she began to cry because she realized he'd finally found his gift. He was a son of Oregon, the pride of America, and the superstar athlete that put Nike on the map. And even though his life was cut short, his spirit would live on through Nike, because legends never die. It's 1977, and American shoe brands are growing frustrated with Nike's surging popularity. While the brash upstart is busy kicking up major dust, the competition is even busier, digging up major dirt. One of Nike's main advantages was its business model of importing lower-cost shoes from overseas manufacturers. But Made in America brands Keds and Converse joined forces after discovering a loophole in the tax code that they could use to destroy Nike. It was called the American Selling Price, an old protection-era law taxing shoe imports not by their factory cost, but by the wholesale cost of similar American shoes. Keds and Converse began lobbying the US government to impose the American Selling Price on all shoe importers in general, with Nike in particular, in a shrewd strategy to try and sink the encroaching brand. With the stroke of a pen, overnight, Nike's import duty spiked from 50 cents a pair to an unbelievable $6 a pair. And worse, customs applied the tariff retroactively, going back 3 years. Phil Knight is staring at an invoice so excessive it could effectively bankrupt Nike. He flies to Washington and secures a meeting with an official at the Treasury Department to try and get the bill waived. Phil presents paperwork already approved by the Treasury that exempts Nike from the American Selling Price. It's going to be a long day in DC. Phil tried arguing that Nike was being unfairly targeted by jealous competitors using an outdated law, but the inspector is unmoved. Unable to make any headway, Phil decides to just get real and have a heart-to-heart with the man, informing the nice agent that this bill, in all honesty, would put Nike completely out of business. After a long, dramatic pause, the official finally responds. Yet again, Nike is in a fight for its very survival. It previously vanquished Onitsuka, but this time around they would have to go up against a far more formidable foe, the federal government. And this time, they're faced with a legal obstacle so insurmountable that they can't get around it. This time it's going to take more than hope or luck. It's going to take an actual plan. But not just any plan. They would need to come up with something so bold, so drastic, something so utterly preposterous that it could even qualify to be considered crazy enough to work. A diabolical plot by its competitors has Nike marked for death. But Phil Knight isn't going down without a fight. Nike is clashing with the US government in court over their tax liability. And with nothing to lose, Phil concocts a super sketchy plan to beat his competitors at their own game. What if they created a fake shoe company and used an American factory to make an incredibly cheap knockoff and price it just slightly above cost? Then customs would have no choice but to apply the American selling price to Nike imports based on their own bogus shoe. It was such an absurd idea that his employees initially thought he was joking. But the more they thought about it, the more it began sounding like maybe it was actually worth a try. But for this caper to work, the phony brand not only needed to appear legit on paper, its product would also have to look the part. Borrowing from the design of their Oceania model, Nike would forge their own shoe. They spun up the One line, complete with its own logo and sparing no expense, even produced a fake catalog to go with it. This was it. It had all come down to this. Nike was attempting an unbelievably outlandish scheme to escape the guillotine. It was a long shot, a desperate Hail Mary. But would it, could it, actually work? Shockingly, the insane risk miraculously paid off. Customs actually began using the One line to assess import duty on Nike, reducing its tax burden by 2/3. Nike would spend the next few years in court fighting to get their tax liability dismissed, and eventually got it reduced from $25 million down to $9 million. And that amount was no problem, because by that time, they had already gone from near bust all the way to the moon. It's the late 70s, and NASA's preparing to enter an exciting new era by launching the Space Shuttle program. With astronomical funding, they were able to push the boundaries of space exploration further than ever before. At the time, aerospace engineer Frank Rudy was working on helmets with a process called blow rubber molding that involved placing dense gases inside rubber pouches. It was during his work on this project that Rudy would make a startling discovery. These pressurized airbags could also provide the perfect cushioning for running shoes. It was a wild idea, but if it could actually work, then it just might be the future. The space age was in full force, ushering in a new wave of innovation as mankind was hurtling towards the cosmos on a mission of discovery, seeking a new frontier of uncharted territory with the promise of limitless possibilities. And with it, Nike was about to boldly go where no company had gone before. While running was understood to be a healthy activity, it still posed risks. On average, runners' feet hit the ground 100 times per minute, with each impact taking a heavy toll on the joints. But Frank Rudy was convinced he had the perfect solution. The result was a breakthrough so innovative, it was revolutionary. He pitched his patented invention to 23 shoe companies, including Adidas, but was rejected by every single one of them. And when he finally presented it to Nike, he was once again met with the same resistance. Phil Knight just wasn't interested. The futuristic concept of air soles seemed like a cheesy gimmick, something out of a comic book instead of a legitimate technological advancement. But Frank managed to convince Phil to at least try them on and go for a run first. While their waffle trainer helped keep athletes' feet firmly to the ground, this new shoe would, believe it or not, have them walking on air. Phil went for an exhilarating 6-mile run and returned with a different view. They agreed to a deal that would pay Frank Rudy 15 cents for each pair sold. A year later at the Honolulu Marathon, Nike introduced the world to the Tailwind, the first shoe to utilize Frank Rudy's state-of-the-art air sole, a concept that was simply out of this world. The Tailwind was a marvel of technological innovation never before experienced by runners, ushering in the next generation of footwear. But it would be the arrival of a once-in-a-lifetime athlete from a different sport that would take Nike Air into the stratosphere. He was born in Brooklyn, New York, but was raised in Wilmington, North Carolina. When he tried out for the high school basketball team the first time, he didn't make the cut. And he took that personally. Michael Jordan began channeling all of his anger into training harder. He became a man possessed, spending countless hours practicing his craft. But more than basketball, his true passion was for winning. He returned the following year, finally earning a spot on the team. And in college, he would emerge as a phenom, igniting the mythical career of the GOAT. After graduating, Jordan would lead the U.S. Olympic team to gold in '84. But he was ultimately destined for superstardom in the NBA. In his rookie season, Jordan was picked 3rd overall in the draft by the Chicago Bulls. Now, as a pro athlete, he can capitalize on lucrative endorsements, and he only wants to represent one brand, Adidas. But Phil Knight can't let that happen, and makes an unbelievable offer that Jordan can't refuse and Adidas can't match. $500,000 a year for 5 years. It was an unprecedented amount, 3 times higher than any other deal in the league at the time. Plus, they were offering to create his own signature shoe, something no other company was even thinking of doing. But this sweetheart deal would come with a bitter clause. Either win Rookie of the Year, become an All-Star, or average 20 points a game within the first 3 years, or the contract would be terminated.
It really can be a spectacular night for the Bulls as Jordan has come up with another steal.
Look at the floor, let's watch. Out for Jordan, this should be an easy 2. Kaboom! On the break, driving all the way in. Oh, God! An unbelievable move! He's put it in and it counts! 2 seconds remaining, Jordan with a seam. What a jam!
In his first season alone, he averaged nearly 30 points per game, became an All-Star, and won Rookie of the Year. But shockingly, he wasn't allowed to play in his own shoes, because the NBA would take drastic action against the Jordans, outright banning them from the league. During the preseason, MJ would wear a prototype of the Air Jordans decked out in their signature colors, black and red. But the bold color scheme resulted in unintended consequences. The design actually violated a long-standing uniform policy that required all shoes to be at least 51% white, prompting a heavy-handed response by the NBA. They fined Jordan $5,000 for the infraction and sent a stern letter to Nike. In the ultimate irony, the company had acquired a superstar athlete but wouldn't be able to capitalize on their endorsement deal. An arbitrary rule from the NBA was preventing Air Jordans from garnering publicity while MJ was busy electrifying the crowd.
Jordan stole it away. Can he get to the hoop? Another visit to Slam City.
But if the NBA wasn't going to allow the Air Jordans to be seen on the court, then Nike would just have to fight fire with a fire ad.
On September 15th, Nike created a revolutionary new basketball shoe. On October 18th, the NBA threw them out of the game. Fortunately, the NBA can't stop you from wearing them. Air Jordans from Nike.
The commercial was an overwhelming success, as Nike raised the mystique of the Air Jordans by leveraging their banned status in the NBA, implying that they were outlawed over its function rather than its form. But it would be Nike's next move that would cement the Air Jordans as the most iconic sneaker in history. The uniform policy technically only applied to official NBA games, and not necessarily to the All-Star Weekend's dunk contests. The perfect venue to showcase the Air Jordans for maximum exposure. That night, a flamboyant Michael Jordan adorned with 2 gold chains would take the spotlight and deliver the first of many show-stopping performances in his signature shoes.
First round, he went out there with warm-ups on. Look at this. Now he's putting down
tape on the foul line.
That's for the old take.
That too.
Almost the length of the court he's going to go from. Here comes Michael Jordan.
I can't miss. Diamonds on my neck and on my wrist. Now they tryna get me out of mix. That's why me and bro, we don't mix. Told a friend, shawty, why you such a snitch?
Yeah, I might do the dash, sell it quick. Shawty brand new, just like the kicks. And they mess a killer of the whip. Pockets fat and my shawty looking thick.
Hey, and my shawty looking thick. Said she might be coming, I said I'ma need some pics. I don't need nobody else, it's me, myself, to say. I just make clean money, I don't need to hit no legs. Swear I got my fam, throw it all, that's on my life. I can't trust nobody else, if they ain't by my side. Baby, you gon' learn, I'm not like these other guys. We been working early, then we party every night. Oh, I swear shit been getting real. Your jokes, I've been in the city still. I'm home, they said that they finna kill. They won't, oh yeah. I can't miss. Diamonds on my neck and on my wrist. Now they tryna get me out of mix. That's why me and bro, we don't mix. Told a friend, shawty, why you such a snitch?
Yeah, I might do the dash, sell it quick. Shawty brand new, just like the kicks. And they mess a killer of the whip. Pockets fat and my shawty looking thick. Taking fat like Jordan, I be blowing scoring. Diamond dip, they pouring.
The sales target set for the Air Jordans was $3 million within the first 3 years. But they would end up smashing that number in the first year alone, making $126 million in sales. With the amazing success of the Air Jordans, Nike was finally able to surpass Adidas. But shockingly, it would give up the title of top shoe seller in America, because a dark horse would emerge from out of nowhere to steal the #1 spot.
I can't miss. Diamonds on my neck and on my wrist.
It's the 1980s, and a hot new fitness craze called aerobics is sweeping the nation. It was developed by Air Force vets who created workout routines that didn't require weights. Set to up-tempo music and performed in a group setting, the high-energy classes began popping up in gyms across the country, attracting mostly women and spreading like wildfire. Aerobics was the next big thing, and one shoe company was taking notice. But it wasn't Nike or Adidas. It was Reebok, an iconic British brand that recently hopped the pond, spoiling for a fight. While attending his wife's aerobics class, an executive at Reebok spots an opportunity. The women in the studio were either wearing uncomfortable running shoes or simply opting to go barefoot. There wasn't a shoe on the market for aerobics yet. Seizing the moment, Reebok would quickly introduce the Freestyle, the world's first athletic shoe designed exclusively for women. Thanks to the technology of the day, the VCR, fitness personalities like Richard Simmons and Jane Fonda began releasing videotapes instructing the masses from the comfort of their homes, turning a niche exercise into an overnight sensation. Aerobics was having a major moment, and Reebok was riding its wave, all the way to the top. They also released bold neon colors for the shoe, extending their appeal beyond fitness and into fashion. In 1985, Hollywood star Sybil Shepherd would wear a bright orange pair on the red carpet, becoming a spectacle while firmly establishing the Freestyle as the it shoe of the time. Rather than directly compete with Nike and Adidas, they instead created their own category, ultimately unlocking the huge, underserved women's athletics market. And with that momentum, Reebok began releasing men's lines with the same stylish versatility, pioneering the trend of sneakers being worn fashionably. Reebok had become such a force in the mainstream, it even collaborated on a shoe for the blockbuster movie Aliens. The athletic shoe industry was booming. By 1986, Nike's sales reached $860 million, and Reebok would surpass the swoosh by totaling $920 million, officially edging out Nike and Adidas to become the top-selling shoe brand in America. The company's forward thinking enabled them to completely sidestep both giants and gracefully tiptoe past them in a photo finish for first place. But it wouldn't last for long, because Nike, the consummate innovator and perennial trendsetter, would begin embarking on the development of their most radical shoe ever. In 1981, Nike hired Tinker Hatfield, a graduate architect and fellow Oregonian that also ran track for Coach Bowerman. He was brought on board to design Nike's office buildings, warehouses, and storefronts. But now, as competition intensified, an overwhelmed Nike held a contest, inviting in-house designers to help them create a new shoe. A curious tinker submitted a design that impressed Nike so much they requested his help with their newest line, called the Air Max. He had made his first and only shoe design on a whim. Now he was given free rein over a daunting new project. It was unbelievable pressure, but Tinker would find inspiration from the unlikeliest of places. He was visiting Paris when he encountered the Centre Pompidou, an infamous art gallery with an unconventional inside-out design that turned the art world upside down. The architects of the museum placed the building's inner workings, its pipes and wiring, and even its escalators on the outside of the building for the world to see. The industrial aesthetic was a bold and controversial design that would be heavily criticized by many citizens who deemed it an unappealing monstrosity. But for Tinker, it was love at first sight. He returned to Oregon a changed man. The striking design of the Centre Pompidou laid the seed of an idea that sparked his vision. This would be an entirely new concept, pushing the limits of shoe design further than anybody at Nike could have imagined. But it could also be a major risk if it flops while warring with Reebok. Nike's patented Air Sole had defined the company for nearly a decade. It was a revolutionary advancement that provided quantifiable improvements for runners. But for all of its promise, the technology was still hidden inside the shoe, invisible to the naked eye. To the uninitiated, Nike Air was perceived as nothing more than clever marketing. For Tinker, seeing was believing. so he decided to remove part of the shoe, to create a window into the midsole that set Nike apart. It was a bold and risky idea that went beyond aesthetics. A concept of this magnitude would require structural changes to the air sole itself. At a time when Nike was trying to make its air units smaller, Tinker was suggesting they make them even bigger and also make them visible. His idea was initially rejected by many within Nike, fearing the exposed airbags would puncture. Tinker began making enemies as irate coworkers lobbied to get him fired. But Tinker pressed on, fighting tooth and nail for his vision. He spent 2 long, hellacious years in R&D, working with engineers on a project that everyone deemed was going a step too far. After extensive trial and error, finally, in March of 1987, Nike was ready to release the Air Max, unveiling not just another shoe, but a modern work of art. To capture the enormity of such a momentous occasion, Nike spared nearly no expense by introducing the Air Max in a groundbreaking television commercial that featured the Beatles' hit song, Revolution. It was the first time in history that a commercial actually featured a popular song. Prior to that, companies had only ever used cover versions. But Nike had the real thing. The only thing they didn't have was permission. The Beatles record label would sue Nike for $15 million for the song's unauthorized use. But ultimately, it wouldn't matter, because the Air Max would become a smash hit. And a year later, Nike would reclaim the top spot back from Reebok. By 1988, Nike had conquered the athletic footwear industry, reigning supreme as the undisputed leader. And the only place to go was up. For 20 years, the shoe brand was obsessed with helping elite athletes maximize their performance. The mission was always deeper than that. The spirit of Nike was always tied to the belief of the potential that existed inside every human being. And they needed a slogan that could perfectly encapsulate that sentiment. Inspiration is often elusive, but can sometimes be found where you least expect it. This time, it wasn't another hotshot athlete that caught Nike's attention, but a cold-blooded murderer instead. After his girlfriend broke up with him, Gary Gilmore went on a violent crime spree, killing 2 innocent people before being apprehended. The case made headlines, as Gilmore was set to be the first man executed after the Supreme Court reinstated the death penalty. Ironically, the American Civil Liberties Union fought to stop his execution, while Gilmore himself was pushing for it to proceed. Ultimately, Gilmore got his wish and was sentenced to death by firing squad.
The warden, having read aloud the legal order that Gilmore must be shot for his crime, asked quietly for any last word. Gilmore said, "Let's do it."
Gilmore's infamous last words intrigued Dan Wyden, a Portland ad man who had recently started an agency and taken on his first client, Nike. Their newest campaign focused on the various sports they made shoes for, but Wyden wanted to give it a unifying tagline that would appeal to the general public as much as it would to elite athletes. Borrowing from the killer's defiant attitude, he crafted a slogan that leapt off the page. It was something completely different from the standard sunshine and rainbows marketing of most companies at the time. This wasn't ad copy. This was a call to action. It didn't matter what your age was, or what your gender was, or what your fitness level was. It didn't even matter what the goal was. As long as you had something to achieve, then Nike had a simple message for you. Just do it. It became one of the most iconic slogans in history, transcending sports and turning non-athletes into raving fans. But nothing could prepare for what was to come. Charles Barkley began his illustrious career as the franchise player for the Philadelphia 76ers. Far from flashy, Sir Charles gained prominence on the polished hardwood as an aggressive rebounder, a fierce defender, and an all-around relentless playmaker. In '93, he led the Phoenix Suns to the finals against Michael Jordan and the Chicago Bulls.
And they're trying to do that again. Barkley with the steal. Well, Charles had that diagnosed, and he's tied the game at 35.
And while the Suns would ultimately lose the championship, Barkley would still finish the season strong as the year's MVP. Off the court, Sir Charles would visit schools to speak to the students and noticed an unsettling trend. He asked the kids at the predominantly white schools what they wanted to be when they grew up, and the majority of responses were doctor, lawyer, and engineer. But when he asked the kids at the predominantly black schools, the overwhelming choice was athlete and entertainer. The sobering experience really bothered him. Frustrated, Sir Charles approached Nike with an insane idea. He proposed they make a commercial that projected the celebrity status placed upon athletes and the undue responsibility it came with. It was a risky move, but Nike was on board. The NBA, however, was not. The league was completely against the idea and didn't want to be associated with it in any way, going as far as forbidding the use of NBA apparel in any such ad. But no matter how far they tried to distance themselves from it, there was no escape from the impact of the groundbreaking commercial that sent shockwaves across America.
I am not a role model. I'm not paid to be a role model. I am paid to wreak havoc on the basketball court. Parents should be role models. Just because I dunk a basketball doesn't mean I should raise your kids.
The Not a Role Model ad is arguably the most daring commercial in television history, sparking a national debate about whether or not athletes were obligated to be good role models for the youth they influenced. Nike received an outpouring of support from the general public, while most columnists condemned the ad, shaming Barkley for rejecting his responsibility to kids as a pro athlete. Despite the flack he received from the sports world, Sir Charles stood his ground, because nobody could convince him that it was wrong to tell kids to listen to their parents, and not a basketball player they've never met.
Labour activists are accusing sportswear manufacturer Nike of encouraging low wages and inhumane conditions at its factories in Indonesia.
In the mid-90s, investigative journalists broke a story that rocked the nation. They exposed the inconvenient reality of sweatshops, a scourge that's plagued the textile industry since its inception, persisting for hundreds of years and crossing all borders, including America.
Now, authorities say one of the most feared hoodlums in the Gambino family, this man, John Gotti, is pouring mafia money into something a lot of people thought had all but disappeared years ago, the garment industry sweatshop. State investigators say in the last few years, Gotti and other Gambino family hoodlums have been behind the scenes in setting up mafia-financed and mafia-protected sweatshops. Hundreds and hundreds of sweatshops have opened in old, rundown loft buildings, hiring illegal aliens and others who can't or won't complain about low wages and dangerous working conditions, making big profits for mobsters who can offer the makers of low and medium-priced garments the cheapest labor in town.
Even the biggest brands were not immune from sweatshops.
Nike, the world's leading sportswear manufacturer, has been accused of making billion-dollar profits from the efforts of workers in the developing world who are paid a pittance. Several human rights groups have spent years scrutinising Nike's ongoing work practices in countries such as Indonesia.
The 90s was also a time when Nike was starting to open retail stores across the country. The the decade would prove to be the darkest time in the company's illustrious history, marred by the reports of inhumane work conditions. College students began organizing protests, raising awareness of the plight of abused factory workers in the Third World. Nike was in the crosshairs of a raucous youth movement calling on the public to boycott the company in support of workers' rights. As the reports kept coming, the movement kept spreading, and the anger kept rising. For Nike, the air was getting thick.
Clothes being sold in the bookstore are non-sweat free, which means child labor, forced labor, people working in sweatshops. I don't think that our university needs to be involved in promoting child slave labor.
The revelations would leave the company flat-footed. Since the beginning, Nike had always relied on overseas manufacturers to produce its products. It never occurred to them to dictate to their suppliers how to run a shoe factory, since they didn't know how a shoe factory was supposed to be ran anyway. Nike denied direct involvement, but would begin instituting a strict code of conduct for its subcontractors. But the fuse had already been lit. Sweatshops became the defining issue of the 90s, as more brands would be exposed for using them, including a very well-known television personality.
12 and 13-year-old children were making clothes for TV host Kathy Lee Gifford's label.
In the factory that made her clothing, there were 130 children, 13, 14, and 15 years of age. They were getting 31 cents an hour, half of what was necessary to live on. They went to bed hungry. There were four-armed guards in the factory. This was the reality.
At first, Gifford was stunned by the accusation.
And I truly resent this man impugning my integrity. You can say I'm ugly, you can say I'm not talented, but when you say I don't care about children, that I will exploit them for some sort of monetary gain, for once, mister, you better answer your phone because my attorney is calling you today. How dare you?
But as the biggest brand in the apparel industry, Nike served as a lightning rod for the collective outrage over sweatshops. The public pressure only intensified as the boycotts continued. The brand was losing money year over year as sales plummeted, bringing the footwear giant to its knees.
Swoosh is on everything from jackets to caps, but business just isn't what it used to be. The company that all but invented the athletic shoe business is now laying off 1,600 workers. Profits are down 69%.
Once beloved, Nike was now viewed as an evil empire, and Phil Knight was the devil, vilified in the media by journalists, filmmakers, and even cartoonists alike. Phil realized that as the CEO of the world's most recognizable brand, he would have to be the one to lead the entire industry out of the darkness that was enveloping Nike, while others were freely operating unabated in its shadow. And so, in the spring of 1998, Mr. Knight goes to Washington and takes the stage at the National Press Club to make a bold declaration. He announced historic initiatives Nike was taking to combat the exploitative practices discovered in its factories. Nike will be raising the minimum age of its workers to 18. Plus, they will be applying US OSHA guidelines to its partner factories. And they will be publishing public audits of the factories as well. Nike was taking unprecedented measures to restore trust back into its brand, while inviting their competitors to join them in putting trust back into the industry itself. It was a crucial turning point for Nike. Even the company's harshest critics would concede that they were making commendable strides. He had been through hell, chasing the thrill of victory while experiencing the agony of defeat. But by raising Nike's standards, he was able to rally back and reclaim their position as the global leader of the athletic apparel industry in one of the most stunning comebacks in the history of business. A business that only started after Phil Knight chose to go down a path that would ultimately lead him to a life of play.